They say you can measure a person's soul by how they treat the ones they think don't matter. Nancy Walker had spent 20 years in Titan Corporation, pushing her cleaning cart through polished hallways that smelled of expensive cologne and fresh ink on million-dollar contracts. Every morning, her faded red shirt blended into the shadows of the marble walls, her hair neatly tied back, her head bowed like a ghost that no one saw. The executives rushed by, eyes locked on their phones, voices sharp with power. They didn't notice the deep lines on her hands or the quiet intelligence burning in her gaze. They didn't see the way she paused by the boardroom door, how her fingers brushed the glass as if she were listening to the building's secrets. She knew every corner of Titan, the whispers in the hallways, the deals struck over scotch at midnight, the laughter echoing in closed rooms where they joked about people like her. To them, she was invisible, but invisibility is a dangerous thing when it belongs to someone who sees everything. That morning, as she polished the conference table that would soon hold the fate of powerful men, Nancy's eyes were calm. She watched the reflection of her faded red shirt on the glass surface, a quiet storm waiting to break. Somewhere behind her, young Emma Brown hesitated, holding a stack of reports close to her chest, her eyes fixed on Nancy as if sensing an earthquake beneath the ground. Nancy felt it too. Today was the day the cracks would become canyons. Today, the woman they had ignored for so long would finally stand in the light. Nancy Walker had always known how to disappear. Each day, before the sun lit the steel and glass towers of Manhattan, she slipped into her faded red shirt, tied her hair back, and stepped onto the subway with the same steady calm that had carried her for decades. At Titan Corporation, her arrival was as silent as a breath. Security guards nodded without really seeing her. Receptionists smiled blankly, already lost in their screens. Nancy moved through the grand lobby, her cart rolling beside her like a quiet companion. The marble floors shone under her careful touch, each surface reflecting the ruthless ambition of the people who passed her by. They wore tailored suits, expensive watches that gleamed like tiny suns on their wrists. Their conversations sliced the air: mergers, market shares, strategies that decided who would rise and who would be crushed. They never paused to look at the woman kneeling to pick up their spilled coffee or wipe the fingerprints off the glass doors. To them, she was part of the furniture, an echo of movement that didn't matter. But Nancy noticed everything: the whispers in the elevator about layoffs, the smirk on David Harris's face when he belittled a young analyst for a minor mistake, the way Greg Summers slammed his office door after a bad call with investors, cursing under his breath. Nancy collected these details the way some people collect stamps or fine wines. Every cruel laugh, every careless word, each silent insult. She carried them all in her mind, each piece a shard in a growing mosaic. She moved from floor to floor, her red shirt a quiet blaze in a world of gray and blue suits. In the cafeteria, she watched Emma Brown. Emma sat alone most mornings, stirring her coffee too long, her eyes darting nervously at the older managers. Nancy saw the kindness in her, the sharpness hidden beneath her shy smiles. Their eyes met one morning. For a moment, the noise of the cafeteria seemed to fade. Nancy offered the smallest nod, and Emma felt something shift inside her, though she couldn't name it yet. Nancy pushed her cart past the conference rooms, past the walls lined with awards and framed headlines. She paused at the main boardroom door, her reflection staring back at her from the polished glass. Her faded red shirt glowed softly under the fluorescent lights, a quiet defiance against the corporate shine. She knew every inch of this building better than any executive did. She knew where the real power hid, which offices whispered the most secrets, which men thought themselves untouchable. Nancy wiped a smudge from the glass, her fingers moving with patient precision. Behind her, someone laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound that echoed too loudly. David Harris. He swept past without a glance, his cologne strong enough to drown out the stale coffee and stress that clung to the morning air. Nancy's eyes followed him for a moment, then returned to her work. Every day, she absorbed these small humiliations, each one adding fuel to a quiet, steady flame. They didn't know the truth. They didn't know that the woman in the faded red shirt was not just cleaning up after them. she was waiting. And the day she would stop being invisible was closer than any of them could imagine. Nancy's red shirt seemed to glow brighter against the cold steel of Titan Corporation's hallways. She moved with quiet purpose, her cart rolling beside her, carrying the tools she used to erase everyone else's mess. But what no one realized was that while she wiped away fingerprints, she was also gathering them, collecting invisible trails of arrogance, carelessness, and cruelty. In the executive lounge, she paused to straighten the rows of bottled water and expensive fruit platters. The televisions played endless news loops, finance channels droning about quarterly earnings and market shifts. Nancy's eyes flicked up briefly, catching a segment about Titan's upcoming board reshuffle. No one else in that room paid attention to her. They leaned on the counters, joked about bonuses, and barked orders into their phones. Nancy moved past them, her gaze steady, her movements fluid like a quiet current beneath stormy waves. Downstairs in the cafeteria, Emma Brown watched it all unfold. Emma was only a few weeks into her job at Titan, her ID badge still stiff and new. She sat with a plain notebook open beside her untouched sandwich, her pen tapping nervously as she listened to the older analysts brag about their achievements. She felt small, almost invisible. But every time she saw Nancy glide past, something inside her stirred, a feeling she couldn't quite name, an echo of strength she longed to touch. One morning, Emma gathered the courage to follow Nancy. She trailed behind at a careful distance, weaving between rushing interns and self-important managers. She watched as Nancy paused by a glass door leading to the strategy department. Nancy's fingers hovered over the handle for a moment, then she slipped inside quietly. Emma crept closer, peeking through a narrow gap. Inside, Nancy moved with a grace that felt almost rehearsed. She pulled a thin folder from a forgotten shelf, her hands moving with deliberate care. She flipped through the pages, her eyes sharp, her expression unchanging. Emma's heart pounded. What was in that file? Nancy closed the folder, slid it back, and turned as if she sensed Emma's eyes on her. Their gazes locked for an instant. Emma froze, her breath caught in her throat. Nancy didn't flinch. She gave the faintest nod, a silent acknowledgement that seemed to say, "I know you're there." "And that's okay." Emma backed away, her mind spinning. She had thought of Nancy as just another quiet face, a fixture in the background. But now, the image of Nancy standing in that private office, reading confidential papers with unshakable calm, wouldn't leave her. That evening, as the city lights flickered to life outside the high-rise windows, Emma sat at her desk long after everyone else had left. She kept replaying that look in her mind, the quiet power behind Nancy's eyes. She scribbled a note in her notebook, her hand trembling slightly. Nancy Walker. "Who are you really?" Meanwhile, Nancy finished her last round, polishing the glass panels so clear they seemed to vanish into the night. Her reflection stared back at her. A woman in a faded red shirt, but beneath the fabric, something unbreakable. She checked the security cameras discreetly, noting every movement, every face. Tomorrow, she thought, tomorrow we get closer. And as she wheeled her cart into the service elevator, a small, knowing smile touched her lips. The kind of smile no one at Titan had ever bothered to notice. David Harris believed the universe owed him something. His stride through Titan's hallways was a declaration of ownership, his laughter a weapon sharp enough to cut through any sense of decency. Nancy watched from the edge of the hallway as David berated a junior analyst in front of a group. His voice dripped with mockery. "You think numbers just fix themselves? Maybe you should go mop floors with Nancy here instead of wasting my time." The analyst's shoulders caved, eyes darting to the floor as if searching for an escape. David's friends roared with laughter, their echo bouncing off the polished walls. Nancy felt her fingers tighten around her rag, but she forced her breath to remain steady. She knew these moments all too well, the public humiliations, the poisonous jokes, the way power corroded whatever humanity once lived inside these men. Greg Summers wasn't any better. Tall, always impeccably dressed, Greg carried a smirk like a badge of honor. He prowled the office, his eyes scanning for weaknesses, for someone to dominate. He thrived on fear, prided himself on being the unchallenged shark in a sea of desperate fish. That afternoon, Greg burst into the strategy room, slamming a folder onto the table. "Pathetic," he snapped at a young marketing associate. "If you can't even prepare a basic trend report, maybe you should ask our dear janitor to train you. At least she knows how to keep things clean." The room fell into cold silence. The associate's lips trembled, eyes filling with tears that she desperately fought to hide. Nancy, standing quietly in the corner with her cart, looked up just long enough for Greg's gaze to meet hers. His smirk deepened, satisfied at the damage he left behind. But behind Nancy's calm eyes, a storm was gathering. She saw not just cruelty, but a system that allowed it, fed it, praised it. Emma passed by the room moments later, catching a glimpse of the scene. She saw the associate hunched over the table, hands shaking, and Greg storming out like a conquering king. Emma's eyes shifted to Nancy, who stood silently, shoulders squared, her face unreadable but her energy electric. Emma felt anger boil inside her, something new and hot that she didn't recognize in herself before. At lunch, the managers gathered in their private corner, talking about sports cars, bonuses, weekend getaways. Their laughter loud enough to push other voices into silence. Nancy moved among them like a breeze, refilling water pitchers and wiping spills, her presence invisible to their blind eyes. But she listened. Every careless brag, every casual mention of shady deals and manipulated numbers, every plan to sacrifice staff for quarterly profit margins. Greg leaned back in his chair, his voice carrying through the cafeteria. "Honestly, I think half the staff here are as useless as that old red-shirted ghost floating around. No spine, no purpose." David cackled, nearly choking on his imported sparkling water. "Maybe she should be our next VP of morale. She'd be perfect at making everyone feel worthless." Their laughter rang out again, echoing like a cheap chorus in a hollow theater. Nancy turned, her eyes scanning the room. Across the cafeteria, Emma sat frozen, a fork halfway to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and rising rage. In that moment, Emma understood that Titan's darkness wasn't just in backroom deals or high-level betrayals. It lived here too, in these open wounds left for everyone to see. Nancy moved past, her red shirt almost glowing against the sterile white walls. She paused at Emma's table for a heartbeat. Their eyes met, and for a single electric second, they shared an unspoken vow. Emma's fingers curled into fists on her tray. Nancy nodded slightly before turning away, her cart squeaking softly down the hall. The day had only just begun, but both of them knew the storm was already on its way. Nancy knew the building better than anyone. At night, when the last echoes of laughter died and the corridors turned to glassy silence, she moved like a phantom through Titan's veins. She slipped into offices with keys no one knew she had, her movements measured and silent. Files lay open under her careful hands, papers whispering secrets meant for no one else. Her eyes scanned line after line, expenses that didn't add up, deals with hidden clauses, confidential memos that reeked of betrayal. She gathered pieces of the puzzle, each detail another drop in the reservoir she had been building for years. Outside, Manhattan pulsed with restless lights, but inside Titan, Nancy pieced together a map of rot and decay. Downstairs, Emma couldn't sleep. Her mind replayed the cafeteria moment, the cruel jokes, the way Nancy's eyes had met hers. She felt the pull, a need to understand, to know what power could possibly live behind that faded red shirt. In a sudden wave of resolve, Emma slipped back into the building. The security guard barely glanced up. She mumbled about a forgotten report and disappeared into the stairwell. She crept through the halls, guided by an instinct she couldn't explain. At the far end of the executive wing, she found Nancy standing alone in the glow of a single desk lamp. Nancy didn't flinch. She turned, her expression calm, almost welcoming. Emma froze in the doorway, her breath shallow, heart drumming against her ribs like a trapped bird. Nancy set down the folder in her hands, her fingers resting lightly on its cover. Emma swallowed hard, her voice catching. Who are you really?" Nancy studied her, eyes sharp but not unkind. For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of the air conditioner and the faint rattle of a window somewhere above them. Finally, Nancy stepped forward, closing the space between them. Someone who listens when no one else does, she said softly. Emma's throat tightened. I see everything they try to hide, Nancy continued, her voice like water slipping over stones. I see the fear behind their laughter, the cracks in their pride. The weakness they cover in expensive suits. Emma's eyes glistened, the question trembling on her lips. But why stay silent? Nancy looked past her, as if seeing into the very bones of the building. Because timing is everything, she answered. If you strike too soon, you break alone. But if you wait, if you learn every corner of their fortress, you don't just crack it, you take it all. Emma's breath shook, her body torn between fear and awe. Nancy reached out and gently touched Emma's notebook, which she still clutched to her chest. You have questions, Nancy said, and soon you'll have answers, but you must choose carefully. Knowledge is a heavier burden than ignorance. Emma stared at her, feeling a strange, fierce light ignite inside her chest. Nancy turned away, gathering the documents and sliding them into a hidden compartment of her cart. You should go home now, Nancy said, her voice firm but almost gentle. Emma hesitated, wanting to say more, but no words came. She backed away slowly, her mind a whirl of secrets and possibilities, then turned and ran down the corridor, her footsteps echoing like a pulse. Nancy watched her go, a small, knowing smile flickering at the edge of her lips. She returned to the lamp, her reflection shimmering faintly in the glass wall. Tomorrow, the final pieces would begin to move, and the woman they had all ignored would step into the light at last. The next morning, Titan Corporation vibrated with a strange, electric tension. People hustled past each other with tight smiles and forced laughs, clutching coffee cups like shields. Emma sat at her desk early, her eyes darting toward the hallway every few seconds, her fingers trembling above her keyboard. She hadn't slept. All night, Nancy's words echoed inside her, heavy, sharp, impossible to ignore. In the executive suite above, Robert Mason arrived. His presence shifted the entire floor, like a sudden drop in temperature. Employees straightened their ties, fixed their hair, adjusted their voices to appear calm. But Mason wasn't fooled. He strode into his private office, closing the heavy glass door behind him. Nancy was already there, standing by the window, the morning light spilling across her faded red shirt. For a moment, they said nothing. Their eyes met, two silent conspirators who had waited longer than anyone knew. Mason set down his leather briefcase with a soft thud. It's time, he said simply, his voice low but resolute. Nancy nodded, her gaze drifting over the city skyline. Watched them twist this place into something rotten, she replied. Her voice was soft, but it cut through the room like a blade. They think power is loud, visible, but real power is patient, silent, watching until the right moment. Mason exhaled slowly, tension leaving his shoulders. I always knew you saw more than anyone, he said. You saw through me too. Nancy turned to face him fully, her eyes bright with something almost like sorrow, but stronger. Yes, she said, and you were the only one who didn't look away. Mason stepped forward, his expression shifting from executive calm to something raw, almost human. Do you really want to do this today? He asked. Nancy's lips curved into a small, unwavering smile. I don't want to, she answered. But I have to. They've turned Titan into a monument to ego and greed. It ends today. Mason looked at her for a long moment, then gave a single, slow nod. I stand with you, he said. Nancy crossed to his desk and picked up a single key card, her fingers wrapping around it gently as if it were a living thing. She slipped it into her pocket, her red shirt catching the morning sun like a quiet flame. Outside, the first directors arrived, their voices echoing in the hallway, unaware of the tremor about to split their world. Emma watched them from her cubicle, her heart pounding. She felt the moment coming, like thunder pressing against the walls of her chest. Nancy moved toward the door, pausing as she looked back at Mason. Thank you for believing in what this place could be, she said. Mason's eyes softened, and he gave a tired but genuine smile. Bring them the truth, Nancy, he said. Nancy nodded once firmly, then turned and stepped into the hallway. Each step felt deliberate, heavy with the weight of years spent in silence. The chatter of the directors faltered as she passed, some giving her a passing glance, most not noticing at all. Emma rose from her seat as Nancy approached, her breath catching. Nancy's eyes met hers, and in that instant, something unspoken passed between them, an invitation, a promise. Emma gave a shaky nod, her fingers gripping the edge of her desk until her knuckles turned white. Nancy continued walking, her red shirt a bright, defiant banner against the gray suits and sterile walls. At the end of the hall, she pressed her keycard to the boardroom door. A quiet beep echoed, followed by a soft click. She pushed the door open slowly, stepping into the cavernous room that had always looked down on her. Today, she would not look down. Today, the room would see her, all of her, and they would never be able to unsee her again. The boardroom was a glass cage perched above Manhattan, flooded with pale morning light. Directors shuffled papers, sipped expensive coffee, and rehearsed numbers they thought would secure their power for another year. David Harris leaned back in his chair, legs crossed, smirking at Greg Summers, who mimicked a golf swing with a pen. Their laughter echoed off the sleek walls, a sharp, hollow sound. At the far end of the room, Robert Mason stood near the head of the table, hands clasped behind his back, his face unreadable. The door clicked open. Nancy stepped inside, her red shirt catching the light like a wound that refused to heal. For a moment, no one noticed. Then one director glanced up, his brow creasing in confusion. David's smirk faltered. Greg paused mid-laugh, his pen slipping from his hand and clattering onto the polished table. Nancy closed the door behind her, the soft sound echoing like a final note in a quiet symphony. She stepped forward, each movement measured, calm, unhurried. Mason's eyes met hers. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Nancy turned to face the room. Her voice rose, low but cutting. "I've walked these halls longer than any of you have held these titles," she began. "I have scrubbed your fingerprints off glass walls, picked up your secrets from the trash, listened to your boasts when you thought no one was there." A murmur rippled through the room, chairs creaking, papers rustling like dry leaves. David scoffed loudly, his laugh brittle. "Is this some kind of joke? Who let the janitor in here?" Nancy's gaze locked on him, steady as steel. "David Harris," she said, her voice slicing through the room. "Effective immediately, you are terminated." The words hit the air like a slap. David's face drained of color, his jaw falling open. Greg turned to him, eyes wide, his lips parting in silent disbelief. You can't do this," David sputtered, half standing, half collapsing into his chair. Nancy took another step forward, her eyes never leaving him. "I can," she said, "because I am Titan's majority shareholder." The room imploded in a storm of gasps, shocked whispers, hands flying to mouths, eyes darting to Mason for confirmation. But Mason only watched, a quiet strength beneath his composed expression. Nancy let the silence hang, the revelation rippling through the space like thunder rolling across a valley. David's hands trembled as he looked around, desperate for support. Greg stared at him, frozen. "Security will escort you out shortly," Nancy finished, her tone final, undeniable. David collapsed fully into his chair, his face pale, his once booming presence now a hollow husk. Nancy turned to the rest of the board, her gaze sweeping over each face. "I have been silent because I was learning," she said, "and today I act not out of anger but out of duty to clean what none of you dared to see." She paused, her breath steady, her posture tall. "You have all mistaken fear for respect. That ends today." At the doorway, Emma watched, breathless, her eyes shining with a mix of terror and awe. Nancy's red shirt seemed to blaze under the harsh lights, no longer a faded symbol of invisibility, but a banner of reckoning. In the stunned quiet that followed, Nancy stepped back slightly, her silhouette framed against the vast city skyline beyond the glass. Outside, the sun climbed higher, illuminating the boardroom like a stage at the final act of a long-buried tragedy. And for the first time, they all truly saw her. Greg Summers sat frozen, the echo of David's fall still vibrating in the air like a struck bell. His fingers twitched around the edge of his folder, knuckles turning white as he tried to steady himself. Nancy turned her gaze toward him slowly, her eyes calm and unwavering. Greg swallowed hard, his tongue darting out to wet his lips, his voice cracking as he tried to laugh. "This is absurd," he said, forcing a grin that died on his face before it even formed. "You really think you can?" Nancy raised a hand, and the room fell silent again, as if the air itself refused to carry his words any further. "Greg Summers," she said, her tone even, deliberate. "You believe leadership is about domination, about using fear to break people beneath you." Greg's breath quickened, his chest rising and falling too fast. "You have built your power on humiliation, on silencing voices, on crushing spirits," Nancy continued. Greg shifted in his seat, his eyes darting toward the door, toward the stunned directors, toward Mason, anywhere but Nancy. "I have listened to you insult the staff, belittle the young analysts, manipulate numbers to cover your failures," she said. Her words were slow, each one dropping like a stone into a still pond, sending waves that no one could ignore. Greg's shoulders sagged as if the weight of every secret he had buried was suddenly crushing him. I can change," he stammered, his voice small, his bravado crumbling into ash. Nancy took a step closer, her red shirt glowing in the morning light. "You had years to change," she said, her voice low and almost mournful. "You chose this path every single day." Greg's eyes welled, his fingers trembling as he gripped the arms of his chair. "Please, please," he whispered, barely audible. Nancy stood still, her eyes softening for a moment, as though she saw the last ember of the boy he once was, long before Titan twisted him. But then her expression hardened again. "Greg Summers," she said, her voice now cold, resolute. "You are terminated, effective immediately." A gasp swept across the room. One director covered his mouth with a shaking hand. Another leaned back, as if trying to disappear into the leather chair. Greg slumped forward, head in his hands, his breath coming in shallow, ragged waves. Nancy turned away from him, her gaze sweeping the table, pausing on each shocked face. "This is not vengeance," she said. "This is accountability." Outside the glass walls, the city moved on, unaware that an empire was collapsing in silence above them. Emma stood at the doorway, her hands clasped to her chest, her eyes wide and wet with unshed tears. She watched as Nancy, so often unseen, now commanded the room with a force that could not be denied. Nancy inhaled deeply, her shoulders rising and falling like the slow crest of a wave. She looked at each remaining director, as if weighing their souls in her hands. "You have been warned," she said, her voice low, heavy with finality. "Change or be replaced. Titan will no longer be ruled by fear and arrogance." The room held its breath, no one daring to move or even blink. Greg's quiet sobs echoed, a haunting requiem for a reign that had finally ended. Nancy stepped back, her red shirt shining like a silent flame against the gray world around her. And in that moment, the old Titan began to die, making space for something entirely new. The boardroom felt like the eye of a storm, silent, tense, waiting to see which walls would still be standing when the winds settled. Nancy stood at the head of the table, her hands resting lightly on its polished surface, her red shirt a burning mark against the sterile white lights. Around her, directors shifted in their chairs, their eyes wide and searching, some filled with fear, others with a fragile spark of hope. Robert Mason remained by the window, watching her with a quiet strength, his nods almost imperceptible but deeply felt. Nancy took a slow breath, her gaze sweeping across the faces she had studied for years. "Titan was never meant to be a monument to greed," she began, her voice calm but carrying a current of unstoppable force beneath each word. "It was built to innovate, to inspire, to create value not just in dollars but in human lives." Some directors lowered their heads, unable to meet her gaze. Others leaned forward, drawn in despite themselves, as if hearing a language they had long forgotten. Emma stepped into the room fully now, no longer just an observer at the door. Her presence sent a ripple through the air, a signal of something new rising beneath the surface. Nancy's eyes found Emma, and she paused, allowing the moment to breathe. "Real power doesn't come from silencing others," Nancy continued. "It comes from listening, from raising each other up, from daring to build something bigger than yourself." Emma's eyes shone with tears she no longer tried to hide. She stepped closer to the table, her hands trembling slightly, but her voice strong when she finally spoke. "I want to help," Emma said, her words echoing like a vow. I want to help you rebuild Titan the way it was always meant to be. Nancy's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. Then stand with me, she replied softly. Emma took another step forward, the echo of her shoes against the marble floor like a drumbeat signaling change. Around the table, other directors began to shift, some nodding hesitantly, others looking at each other as if for the first time. The old alliances built on fear started to fracture, replaced by something fragile but alive, the first fragile shoots of trust pushing through cracked concrete. Nancy turned back to the directors, her expression both fierce and kind. This is your chance, she said. Those who choose to stay will rebuild a Titan founded on respect, transparency, and courage. Those who cannot, there is the door. Silence wrapped the room again, but it was no longer the silence of terror. It was the charged hush before a first breath, a collective exhale after years of suffocation. Mason stepped forward finally, his voice strong and warm. I support this, he declared, fully, and I will hold each of you accountable to these new values. The room seemed to lean forward, the future hanging in the balance like a note held just before release. Emma looked around, her heart hammering with a wild, terrified joy. She saw the faces of colleagues she once feared, now unsure but open, waiting to be led. Nancy's gaze returned to her, and in that shared moment, Emma felt herself transform from a shadow into a spark. She nodded once, fiercely. Nancy extended her hand toward her, and Emma grasped it, the connection like a circuit finally closed. The directors watched, some rising slowly, each movement a small act of rebirth. Outside, the city roared and shimmered in the morning sun, but inside the boardroom, something far brighter had begun to burn. And Titan, once a fortress of arrogance, began to breathe for the first time in years. The days that followed felt like waking up after a long, fevered dream. Titan's hallways, once echoing with sharp commands and brittle laughter, now hummed with a different energy, cautious, raw, but alive. Nancy walked those halls without her cart for the first time in decades. People looked up as she passed, their eyes no longer sliding over her like she was invisible. Some nodded, others stepped aside in respect, their faces tense but searching for guidance. Emma moved beside her, a notebook always in hand, her questions endless, her steps quick to match Nancy's calm, steady stride. They met with department heads, engineers, analysts, people who had once kept their heads down and voices soft. Nancy listened more than she spoke, her eyes attentive, her posture open. She asked them what they needed, what they dreamed for Titan, and one by one, hesitant at first, they answered. Emma scribbled every word, her fingers sometimes trembling with the weight of what they were building. One afternoon, in a newly cleared conference room, Nancy and Emma sat together, papers spread like maps of an uncharted world. Emma tapped her pen against her lip, then looked up, her eyes fierce. We could restructure the mentorship program, she suggested. Pair junior analysts with senior managers who actually care. Build real relationships, not just quotas. Nancy's smile spread slowly, like dawn over the city's skyline. Good, she said. Real change is always built person by person, brick by brick. Emma leaned back, her heartbeat a wild symphony in her chest. In those moments, she felt her old fears crack and fall away, replaced by a quiet strength that surprised even her. In the cafeteria, whispers began to shift. People talked about Nancy and Emma, not as outsiders, but as leaders. A junior designer shared how Nancy had asked for her opinion directly. A maintenance worker admitted he had finally spoken up about broken equipment he'd been too afraid to mention for years. Nancy visited each floor daily, stopping to ask questions, offering a steady presence that no one dared to laugh at anymore. In quiet corners, some employees still clung to the old ways, plodding softly, their eyes darting with leftover fear and pride. Nancy saw them. But she did not move against them with immediate force. Instead, she watched, patient, giving them space to decide change or fade away. One evening, Emma lingered outside Nancy's office, the city lights turning the windows into liquid gold. She hesitated before stepping inside, her voice small but determined. I want to stay, Emma said. I want to help you lead, not just watch. Nancy looked up, studying her closely. "You ready to carry that weight?" she asked. Emma nodded, her throat tight. "I am," she whispered. Nancy leaned forward, her eyes soft but sharp as a blade. "Then from tomorrow, you'll sit beside me at the head table," she said. "You won't just learn, you'll shape Titan's future with me." Emma's breath caught, her heart crashing against her ribs like a tide against rocks. She felt something inside her open, blooming into something bright and wild. Nancy extended her hand, and Emma took it, her grip firm, her doubts dissolving like shadows at sunrise. In that clasp, the past and the future met not as a quiet passing of a torch, but as a shared flame, ready to set the world alight. Morning sunlight poured into Titan's lobby, turning the marble floors into rivers of gold. Nancy stood near the entrance, her red shirt no longer a ghost's uniform, but a banner of quiet revolution. Emma stood beside her, her hands steady, her eyes clear and bright. They looked out across the lobby together, watching as employees began to arrive, each step hesitant but somehow lighter. Some paused when they saw Nancy, offering cautious nods, small smiles that felt like the first breath after drowning. Emma turned to Nancy, her voice soft but unwavering. "Are you ready?" she asked. Nancy's eyes moved over the bustling crowd, then to the distant city beyond the glass doors. "I've been ready my whole life," she answered. Emma took a deep breath, feeling the gravity of this moment settle into her bones. For the first time since she set foot in Titan, she felt like she belonged not just in a seat, but at the very center of change. Nancy nodded toward the hallway leading to the boardroom. "Come on," she said. "It's time they heard your voice too." They walked together, side by side, each step echoing in the newly quiet halls like a heartbeat returning after a long silence. When they reached the boardroom doors, Emma hesitated, her hand hovering above the handle. Nancy placed her hand gently over Emma's. "Don't let them decide your worth," Nancy said. "You define it, you always have." Emma nodded, her jaw tightening with determination. She pushed the door open, the heavy wood giving way with a soft groan. Inside, the directors sat straighter than before, eyes tracking the two women as they entered. There was no laughter now, no careless smirks, only a collective breath held at the edge of something new. Nancy walked to the head of the table, Emma at her side. For a moment, there was only silence, the kind that feels alive and electric, pregnant with 1,000 futures. Nancy rested her hand on the back of a chair, her red shirt glowing like an ember in the dim morning light. "Titan will no longer be built on fear and ego," she said, her voice calm but sharp enough to carve new paths in stone. "It will be built on trust, on respect, on the strength we find in each other." Emma stepped forward then, her voice steady as she joined in. "And from today," she added, her eyes sweeping across the room, "every voice will matter, every soul will be seen." A hush washed over the room. Then slowly, one by one, heads began to nod, cautious at first, then with growing conviction. In that fragile, powerful silence, the foundation of a new Titan began to take shape. Outside, New York roared and glittered under the rising sun. Nancy and Emma turned to leave the boardroom together, stepping back into the lobby where the world waited. They paused at the glass doors, the city stretched before them like a vast, unwritten story. Nancy looked down at her red shirt, then at Emma, a soft smile blooming on her lips. "This was never just about me," she said. Emma met her gaze, her own smile fierce and radiant. "It's about all of us," Emma replied. Nancy opened the door, and together they stepped into the morning light. The city seemed to breathe with them, a silent promise carried on every shimmering rooftop and every crowded street below. And at that moment, Titan Industries and the people within it finally began to live.